is this session all about? MyData Global has the name or the word global in the name of the organization, and it's not by chance. Currently, we have members from more than 50 countries all over the world, and also 20 or more local hubs spreading in all continents. However, it's not a secret that the origins of the MyData movements are in Europe and actually in some parts in Finland, where I'm coming from. And still today, the majority of MyData activities are taking place in European countries. And in order to be able to offer global solutions for global data-related challenges, we must actively engage doers from all over the world with diverse backgrounds and working together. And if you participated on the opening session today, Kalia very nicely put it there that we should not do things for people without including them here. And that's very much the question of also putting MyData into action in different countries. So there is no one size that fits for all. It was also reflecting back the opening session. It was curious to think of the numbers, for example, how many people there are in India. We have 5 million people in Finland altogether, so it's kind of a tiny part of the city in some global sense. So the scales are very different, and also the challenges and the level of infrastructure and the cultures and even the conceptions of identity, how people perceive it. So we really should be opening our eyes to learn from each others, and in this sense, I think it's a lucky incident that we have now the forced opportunity to run this whole conference in fully online. So it's not restriction of the travels and money and so forth who can come and join the MyData conference, but it's available at least without the long distance traveling to everybody. And this, when I was looking at the conference program this year, I have been myself very much involved in the preparing the programs of the previous year's conferences. This year, I was less involved. I was advising on the in the advisory board for the program, but more from the arm's length distance. And when I saw the program coming together, it had a really significant amount of sessions that are looking for the MyData issues from different globally from different corners of the world. So we are right now having a parallel session with this that is looking specifically on the Korean situation, what is happening there. There will be tomorrow session about Japan, and we had the opening plenary about India tomorrow evening. Well, evening, morning doesn't say anything for anybody, so this is the Finnish time zones. But anyways, tomorrow on Friday, we have a Latin American session, and then we have specific session that will be from Kalia. So if you heard the opening speech, you know her background and style and knowledge, and she will be diving deeper to the roots of identity. And there is also the question of different perceptions of identity that we will be seeing and touching on this session as well. So the objective of this session is really that we are speaking quite much of the identity, but more generally also about MyData. So the challenges for building digital IDs and using data are very different around the world. And we want to raise awareness to the fact that the global south, digital global south demands different approaches than some other countries. And it was not easy to come up with a good title for the session. So here, the Digital Global South is kind of an umbrella term. So it's not a geographic or anything like that, but mainly pointing that there are different realities, and some countries are facing similar challenges, whether even if they are in Asia or so forth. So as an outcome of this session, I hope that we create connections and ties, because that's really the essence of MyData community, so that we can know people. It's so much easier to get in the follow-up conversations and real development with some people from different backgrounds if we have met at least once and heard the stories. So we have here opportunity to we have 6 wonderful experts from different corners of the world pushing ahead the human-centric approaches to personal data in their home countries or regions, and they will be sharing the key insights or aspects that we must remember when we are building MyData solutions. So I hope that after this session, it's much easier for us to reconnect and do the detailed work afterwards. So I will be inviting one by one the panelists to just quickly say your name and country and what are you working at. And then afterwards, we will have the rest of the time for 2 topical panels more in detail. And in this time, I welcome the questions here in the chat of the Zoom. So I will be monitoring the chat all the time. And since we are not huge number of people, I see 35 participants in this session. So I think it will be okay also to give voice for people to ask questions, but please ask for your turn in the chat first, and I will be moderating. But first, I will be inviting Charlie, who is also board member of MyData Global. Welcome, Charlie. Who are you? Where are you from?
Thank you, Yogi. Thank you for this very wonderful introduction to our session. And Charlie Martial Ngounou, and that's how I'm named here in Cameroon. And you see, I've turned my tune to say Ngounou. That is my my village language that we say Ngounou. And I'm one of the board members of MyData. I work for Afro Leadership, and we are entitled to be developing MyData hubs in Africa, in most countries. And I think next year will be very, very interesting with more hubs in African countries, as I can say from now. And we work here on creating awareness around personal data, around MyData itself, and also all the digital stuff, digital ID, and also ethics that relates to those domains. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Charlie. And next I will invite Jay to present yourself. I think you are somewhat based at Finland, but also roots in Palestine and Brazil. So who are you, where are you from, and what are you working at? Jay.
Good morning. Thank you. Very glad to be here. So my name is Jamile. You can call me Jay because it's much easier to pronounce. As you said, I am Brazilian Palestinian. I was born in Brazil with a Palestinian family. I am now living in Finland. I work with blockchain technology. I've been studying and working with that for over 5 years now. And like Charlie, I am very interested in the ethical side of things. So we are trying to use this technology, but how do we make sure that we are using it right in a way that benefits people? So that's my jam currently.
Good, thanks. So then going to Korea and US. So Joe, Kim, please introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. I'm Joe. I have a little bit of a unique background, if you will. I was born in Korea, so I have a Korean citizenship. So my passport is Korean, but I left Korea when I was 12 and moved around in different countries. So I spent a few years in Hong Kong, in Singapore, and now I'm in LA to resume college. So yeah, that's I've been moving around a lot, mostly in Asia, and also right now currently living in North America. My interest in MyData began with my initial individual member relationship with the MyData Korea Hub. I was actually an intern when the founding member, TUI consulting company in Korea, spearheaded the foundation of the MyData Korea Hub last year. And I worked very closely with Chris and oversaw, what's happening, the initial management and the foundation and the bylaws and everything that went into the conference that was held last year. So I brought some of that experience here to Los Angeles, where right now we have the first digital rights privacy group called Online Privacy at UCLA, which I'm now currently serving as the founder and the president. And also we have filed I'm not sure if this is a secret, but we filed the LA Hub application very recently. So I'm looking forward to bring the experience that I've oversaw in Korea and bring that over to America in the next year we have. So yeah.
Okay, we are already covering quite many corners of the world and continuing with Kristina from Japan. And I know that you also have roots in different places. So please introduce yourself. And you are also board member of MyData Global.
Hi, thank you, Yogi. Yeah, speaking of different backgrounds, so I was actually born in Russia and then moved to Japan when I was 5. And I grew up there, but I went to college in France and I worked in the US, in the West Coast, but then escaped to the East Coast and now I'm in Tokyo. So yeah, I consider myself as a global child and really this diversity we have, not just in MyData in general, but in this session here. And my relationship with MyData started with my personal relationship with members of MyData Japan. So I closely worked with Nat, with Kazue on mainly blockchain, decentralized digital identity space, which is my passion. And so yeah, and then so I wear 2 hats today. I think my main hat is as the digital at NGO, where we work on issuing digital identity, decentralized identity for these marginalized populations. And I know people spoke about ethics, and my passion is really in the governance. I feel like when you talk about decentralized identities, the conversations sometimes tend to be very technocentric, and it is important. I know myself getting more and more into, technical aspects of the problem we're trying to solve, but at the same time, people tend to forget governance, which is sometimes, an elephant in the room. So that's my jam right now.
Thank you, Kristina. Then going to Southern Asia. So Pyrou, can you introduce yourself as well?
Hey everyone, I'm Pyrou Chung and I'm also a bit of a global trotter. I was born in Cambodia, but I grew up in Australia and now I live in Myanmar. So I am the world is not so global anymore, but we Asians always seem to travel everywhere. So I work for the Open Development Initiative, which is a project of the East-West Management Institute. And we started looking at data transparency across the Mekong region to look at greater sustainability for social and environmental accountability. And we've been expanding for the last 7 or 8 years, and we've come into a new sort of phase in terms of the development of this type of work, considering that open data and openness about data sharing is really quite nuanced across the Mekong region. Our focus has always been Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, Vietnam, and Myanmar. And so the difference in terms of the progress in technology and adaptations of how people share and use data, how people think about data governance and privacy is really quite different and underdeveloped in comparison to most of Southern Asia and other parts of Asia. And so I think that there's an increased heterogeneity within Asia itself, and the scope is so large and diverse that I think these conversations, merging them together as a region, could actually benefit a lot of the underdeveloped countries within the region. And so a lot of our work has been looking at data rights, data governance structures, and particularly around marginalized communities, indigenous communities, specifically refugees and migrants, So that's our particular focus, and I'm happy to contribute to this conversation today.
Thank you, Pyrou. So last but not least, staying on the region, so to Asia. So Sherry, please introduce yourself.
Yes. Hi, everyone. I'm Sherry, and I'm from Taiwan. And so, like when I was born in Taiwan, and my whole life is in Taiwan. So, I'm now a co-founder of a software company called Numbers. And what we do is we're using blockchain technology to help to create the to trace and to ensure the integrity of image. And we want to what we want to solve is the fake news and the disinformation problem. And also, I'm also the one of the initiator of MyData Taiwan. And so during the pandemic, so we also do a app about called MyLog, and it helps people to record your own health record, and so to help to prevent the pandemic. I'm very happy to join the section.
Okay, so thanks. This was already a very good round here to start with. So how we are going to continue here? So I do recommend people again to use the chat for asking questions, putting comments. So hopefully we have lively discussion there. I will be keeping my eye on that, and will raise the questions from the chat or give the floor also for people to ask. But we are going to continue in two different panels, on two different topics. So the first one will be legal identity, citizenship, and other limitations that local governments face. So we can talk about how many people in the South don't even have a digital identity. They might be refugees, their ethnicity, religion might not be recognized by the government, etc. Because of this, we can't build a digital ID in the same way as in let's say, in Finland, where with only 5 million people. So by simply connecting it to existing infrastructure. So the infrastructure may not exist. So providing the first identification is a challenge in many of the countries globally, and we can show how complex that can be. I would be, this panel will be by Jay, Joe, and Sherry. So I will be giving introduction questions to one by one to each of the panelists, and then we continue the discussion. So for the panelists, I also recommend that you talk to each other. So let's have it like a friendly chat here in the global cafeteria table, and then we have our audience who can follow and also join the discussion by chat. So first, Jay, I would ask you, why is this discussion important? What is the point of talking specifically about digital global South?
Thank you, Yogi. So I'm kind of happy to be the first here. It's an honor. So I think that this conversation is important for at least two reasons. The first is that in the North, I think that we sometimes might take identity or identification, to be more specific, for granted, right? You are born somewhere, you get documents from that place, you have access to rights, and you don't really stop to think about identification unless you have a huge problem because something went really wrong. But the truth is that that's not the reality. If we are just thinking about identification, we have 1 in 7 people in the world who lacks a formal ID, right? So that's already 1 billion people who might not even have this basic access to rights, because without papers, you don't have access to education, to healthcare, you cannot have formal employment, and you are in a very vulnerable position. So I think that bringing this topic here, when people most of them are coming from the north. It's interesting to bring attention to this, like, hey guys, just connecting these dots with your government ID to some sort of digital system is not as easy as it sounds, because many people don't even have that, right? So I think that this is a first thing. And the second one is that we tend to look at technology as if it is something neutral, as if it is just connecting the dots, as if technology itself and the choices that we make and the choices that we are allowed to make in given contexts are not political. So I really think that we should be talking about this, because the types of solutions that we can create and the way that we can bring people into the table and give them access to rights will be very, very different depending on where they are.
Okay. Now you are in the panel here. Let's imagine you are sitting on the stage, and I will invite next panelist on stage, Joe. So Joe, welcome here. My question for you is that you have your roots in Korea. So what is the main challenge around these issues in or putting MyData into action that is faced in Korea?
Right. So shortly put, I think there are two big challenges that MyData faces in Korea. And the first challenge, I think, is actually also the reason why MyData has advanced so fast in Korea. And that is because the involvement from the corporates. Korea is perhaps one of the few countries in East Asia that is largely that has industries that are largely influenced by the conglomerate companies such as LG, SK, Samsung. They operate on a variety of industries in Korea. So because a lot of things are being advanced at the corporate level, we're not sure as to how much this would be able to facilitate an ecosystem where it's more open and more inviting. We have more startups, more smaller financial technology companies to enter this ecosystem. But in relation to the topic today, which is more so on the digital identity, I mean, people who don't have identity to start with, is that Korea shares borders with our warring neighbor, North Korea. And that means that among 50 million people in Korea, we have 4 million soldiers on duty every year, whom, when they are on duty, they don't have any access to their own personal information while they're drafted. So they belong strictly to the military intranet network, not internet. So while they're off duty and there's just millions of personal information that will legally be not put in use, where and how do you store that information? There's also a sizable population of North Koreans that cross over to South Korea, and some of them even go back. So how do you deal with the citizens that infringe on their basic rights of having a right to their personal information when they're not being law-abiding citizens, right? I think those are some of the things that Korea needs to address as we quickly move forward in the advancement of MyData in Korea.
Oh, thanks. This is already kind of spreading my mind to very different directions, and I advise you, the panelists, to kind of pick the points what you want to ask from each other, so that we can build the discussion around after the last introduction. So as I would like to invite back to the panel also Sherry, so from Taiwan, and my question for you is that I've heard that there is this MyData portal in Taiwan. Can you share with us some more information about that service? So what is it? What is the vision and the current implementation, and how effective it is?
Yes, okay. In this year, I think it's in July, there's an online service called, it's the same name with MyData. It's called MyData Portal, and in Taiwan, it's launched on the website. And the MyData, it's also the service is also introduced in the short description about Audrey Tom's video for the MyData conference. And I think it's so since this year, since I started to promote the MyData concept in Taiwan, and I'm really happy that I saw the first MyData service which held by the government. And the protocol is that you can authenticate and you can download all kind of the data which government have about you in the previous. So in the past, citizens, you will not know what kind of data the government has, and you have no idea what do they get and what do they don't have. So, but with the first MyData protocol, so I can see my like my household information, my land information, my tax information, and I will know that, oh, so that is the data which the government has from me, and I can authorize and download the data, and also I can apply some like social allowance, or I can apply the credit card with the data I download from the MyData portal, or even though I can just authenticate the data from the portal and send the information to the bank or to the municipal staff. So it will avoid a lot of paperworking, and you can make sure that all the data is approved and to be used by me, and the bank, they can receive the data required for only specific to the service I applied, and they will and I'm sure I can make sure that they don't have the other info. They can get other information because all the information is consent by me. And I have tried for the service because it's I think since July, and maybe it has an update 2 or 3 times. So it's a little, so the service now is very few, so I can only apply the credit card for now, but the service also open for other service provider that you can use the API to get the data from the MyData portal. And I'm also very looking forward to see more service provider which can use the data from the MyData. And I think I have very positive about the MyData protocol. Yes.
Okay, I will take here as a quick question coming from the audience. So Bu Harald asked that it seems that Taiwan is more advanced than Finland in MyData in this sense, but the question or challenge he's posing that is downloading actually the best way? Would it be better to empower services to get access to the data where it is stored?
Yes. I'm also, when I first using this service, I'm also considering that is it download the best way? I have the same question with Bo, but I think since it's the very beginning about the service, so I think maybe the first is that let people can download their own data, and they can choose to keep the data by themselves, or they can still put the data on the cloud service of the government. I think it's the first step, so we can know what kind of data we can access. And I think maybe the next step is if we can just using the portal as an interface, so you can choose what kind of data you would like to access for the specific service provider, and the data can be transferred just via the portal. And also we also need to make sure the data transmission is very secure and has a high privacy. And I think the upgrade and the improvement will still keep going on, and I'm very looking forward for the update of the next version of MyData portal.
Okay, thanks. So it's already interesting by these first hours of this conference. We are hearing from very different and actually large-scale implementations that are related to MyData in different countries. So we heard about India and now about Taiwan, and I think Korea is advancing fast, and there are many other countries. So I think this session and here the panel is also crucial on building the ties so that we can follow these developments, because it may happen very quickly when it starts moving to certain direction. So back to the topic of this discussion, and now you are introduced. We have 3 panelists here in this first panel. So this is a question for everybody to kick off the discussion, and please join and complement each other, so that I will not be pointing anymore one by one questions for each one of you. So generally for the panel, so what do you see that these key, or how the key players act differently in the countries where you are coming from, when you think or compare it to this mysterious global north, which I actually tend to start thinking that we should not do any particular separations on any aspects, but you consider certain differences. So what do you think is how key players play differently in your countries?
Can I go first?
Sure.
So again, I think that there are multiple things that we have to consider. If we are thinking about the government first, right? It will depend so much. Maybe this government that I am thinking about, let's say the government of Palestine, it's almost a failed state. It doesn't have a lot of resources to provide anything for the citizens. Or maybe I have a government that is unwilling to provide identification even. If you take the Rohingya situation in Myanmar, this government doesn't want to recognize that those people have a right to citizenship. The situation of Muslims in India now, they are also having some challenges related to their identity because of their religion, right? So there's such a huge spectrum from a government like the Finnish government, which is not supposedly collecting a whole lot of information about you, or Estonia actually has something similar to Taiwan. You can always see the information that the government has on you, and you need to give them permission to use this information. So they'll be like on the one end, going all the way to a failed state that doesn't have any infrastructure. And there's just so much in between, right? Because there's this, let's say, official information that is collected, but maybe you live in a place that the government is also collecting all sorts of unofficial information, like in Brazil. Our Minister of the Economy, of Finance, he recently ordered a report looking at journalists and other people on Twitter who were being critical of the government. And this was published in a list. And it basically meant, hey, the government is looking into what you're doing. And Brazil is supposed to be a democratic state. That is not really supposed to be happening. But anyway, this data is being collected. It's not in any official register. You're not going to know that what the government has collected, why it has collected, but it's there, right? So the government can have a huge range on how it is behaving. The same goes for companies. If I am in Finland, I have to follow GDPR. There's a limitation on the amount of data that I can collect, what I can do with it. But if I am in a state that doesn't even have a basic legal framework, companies have much more space to act, and then they could maybe do certain things that they wouldn't do in a place with more restrictions. So it really depends so much. And again, I think it's so important that we have this discussion, because even when we are talking about, yeah, let's build MyData principles, or let's build some governance principles, account of the concrete realities on the ground, because really the range is just huge when you are considering 7 billion people in the world and 200 countries, you know.
Good. If other panelists, Joe and Sherry, want to chime in or continue the conversation, I invite you to be here. So don't wait for me to ask questions. Well, this question was, I think it would be interesting also maybe for Joe to go a little bit deeper on the big role of conglomerates, the companies in Korea, because the question that I tried to frame was that who is driving the development of, let's say, digital ID, digital data related systems, and of course government actors have big role in some places, and then corporates can have big role in some places. And the question is that what are the different kind of directions and motivations that take place? And Jay already shed a light a little bit on the different motives that the governmental actors may have, and then also the regulatory restrictions that apply differently to companies. So would be interesting to hear more from Pyrou and Joe also in this topic.
Sure. I could go next. So thank you for sharing. I think with the key players of MyData advancement that is more so unique to Korea is that it's very clear that the two current main players are, number one, the government, specifically the Ministry of Science and Technology and the Korea Data Agency, which is partaking in many of the sessions throughout the conference in the next 2 days. And number two, the conglomerate companies, SK, LG, Samsung. And there is a growing concern that MyData perhaps have the risk of becoming just another market that the conglomerate companies sort of monopolize in terms of both the operator development as well as the services development. And that is because I did mention that there's millions of millions of people that are drafted in the Korean army who have no access to their digital personal information, but there's actually too much data going around in Korea, as with, I guess, some of the more technologically advanced countries in the West. So yeah, Korea is it's very different. In terms of technology, I think it resembles many of the aspects that we see from the West, such as the North America, compared to other neighboring East Asian countries. At the same time, because geographically, the country is still situated in Asia, and also it's unique in the sense that it's sharing borders with a warring nation. Things are also similar with North America, but very different. So currently, as I mentioned briefly, there is a lack of incentives and motivations for small to medium businesses to partake in being the key players of the MyData ecosystem. It's being criticized as being, again, a rise of another market, another area, human-centric digital transformation that is predominantly undertaken by the activities of conglomerate companies. And recently, on January of this year, the credit information passed in Korea, which word to word introduced the MyData industry to the South Korean peninsula, which was mainly targeted towards the financial and the IT industry. But at the same time, because many conglomerate companies in Korea, because their influence is so wide, they also tend to have some legal issues with their business practices in other areas. So recently, 6 major banks and financial technology companies, such as the Hana Bank and the Samsung Card, were deferred from partaking in the development of operator model for MyData until February of next year, because the major stakeholder of those companies infringed on the ethical use of their business practices in a different industry that was unrelated to data, that it's actually slowing down the progress within the next few months. So it's very complex. It's, as I said, the challenge as well as the reason why MyData is advancing fast in Korea is because there is so much emphasis and so much resources that the conglomerate companies can make use of.
Can I ask you, Joe, quickly, if you know if any other East Asian countries face similar kind of barriers, what you are explaining about Korea, or is it unique to Korea?
Right, so directly about how there is too much power being placed on the conglomerates, I'm not sure. I mean, in terms of the way how MyData has been making moderate progress in Korea, I think it somewhat aligns with the advancement that has been made in Japan. I overheard that there's going to be some more government level efforts that's going to try to incorporate more of these MyData / human-centric approach. I think some of the other nations like Taiwan, Japan, Korea, I see them as the more digitally progressing nations out of other neighboring countries, such as, I mean, I'm not sure how long it's going to take for China to be able to incorporate this democracy, right? But I'm not going to get into detail of that since it's being recorded. So yeah.
Maybe jumping back to Taiwan. Sherry, I've heard also that Taiwan has quite well organized health insurance system, and also Taiwan is one of the countries that is actually doing quite well during the COVID-19 pandemic. So will you think the usage of citizens' health insurance ID is well, using that for good of tackling the pandemic is great, but there are also the potential challenges of abusing it, and that kind of discussion is floating in also in Finland when we were bringing, let's say, this COVID-19 app, and now there is a discussion about this vaccination certification and that kind of stuff. So I would like to maybe pick your brain on that situation of Taiwan to close this first panel today.
So, okay. So actually the question is, I discussed the question a lot with my friends for the past few months, because I think it's very hard to balance the convenience and privacy. So for the first few years of the about the COVID-19, like the March and April, the amount of mask is limited. So people can only buy mask with your health insurance card, and the amount is limited. And I know for the first time, the government allowed you to buy the mask in the clinic or the health center, but the density about the clinic and health center is low. It's very few. The density is very low, so they decide to open another sales point at the convenience store. So if you have been to Taiwan, you will know that the 7-Eleven, the convenience store, you just walk maybe 1 or 2 blocks, you can see a convenience store. So I think it's a trade-off that you want to make your citizen can buy the mask more easily. Then you have to maybe give some control to the a sales point which has no relation with any of health center or any drugstore. So I know some of my friends, they refuse to provide their health insurance cards to the staff in the convenience store because they think it's not very secure to let the people who have no related to health and to access your health insurance cards. But they can still choose to buy the mask to the clinic. Just they need to spend more time. So just take example of my sister. She's a mom of the twins baby. So she can't leave her baby at home and to buy mask to the clinic because it's very far from her place. But there's a 7-Eleven just next to her home, so she can just buy the mask for a whole family. So I think it's the trade-off between the convenience and the privacy. But I think the most important thing is I think the government need to still keep the right to choose on the hand of the citizen. So I can choose to use my health insurance card to get more allowance, or I can choose not using my card and not providing my information to the person I have no trust, and the control is owned by myself. I think this is the most important thing. So you have to leave the control on citizens' hand.
Okay,
Yes.
thanks. So yes, I must say that this is challenging panel for me, since we get so much input from different corners of the world, and it really kind of digesting these things, what is important. That's probably challenging also for the participants here in the session. I just advise everybody to focus and think, because that's the real thing. MyData has this slogan of make it happen, make it right. So make MyData happen, and make MyData happen so that it actually leads to better situation in the world, better, well, human-centric control, but also kind of the big principles, so that we get empowerment and not just more of the same, more of the consumption culture, and more of the government control or conglomerate control. So it's easy to see that this might be challenged on both sides. Maybe something is not moving. Maybe the government is so stuck and old-fashioned and moves slowly. I think in this sense, for example, Finnish government is not from the worst, but some Asian governments are much more efficient. When they decide to do something happens really quickly compared to, for example, in Finland. And so there is this make it happen side, but then there is also the make it right side. And it doesn't really matter if you don't make anything happen at all, then somebody else will make something else happen. So then you are just out of the game. But really the worst option is that you make happen something that you didn't want to happen. So make it right. And this balance is very crucial in MyData, that we want to push, we want to find the technologies, we want to implement the governance, we want to put it on scale so that it actually makes people's life better, but at the same time we don't want to be these techno utopians that Kalia referenced, that we just believe that when we build it, it will be great. We have seen so many times technologists believing something is so cool and it will solve all the problems, but actually it's creating new set of problems. So that was my kind of very high level overview from these different inputs from the first panel. And I'm sorry, I'm challenging myself and I'm challenging everybody. It's really not easy to tie these conversations together. But as I said in the beginning, let this be as the first connection point, so that we know people, we know Jay and Joe and Sherry very well after this session, and it's easier for us to get connected what's actually happening in Taiwan, what's happening in Korea, what's happening in Brazil or Finland, so or Palestine. After this, we can really connect in the practical level. And we have, for example, in MyData Global, we have the thematic groups, we have the MyData operators group, and that's really the gist, is to have people from all over the world to bring these knowledge and understanding into deeper discussions. But with this, I will now thank you, Jay and Joe and Sherry, and I will be inviting the next panel on stage one by one. And the topic of the next panel is kind of hybrid of discussing the necessity of physical and digital infrastructure, and then also the different conceptions of identity, what we have. And as the first person in this panel, I would like to invite Pyrou. So welcome on stage, take your seat in this virtual panel. And for the initial question for you would be that what is the main difference between so-called mainstream concepts of identity and that of indigenous people's conceptions of identity?
Thanks, Jogi. I have to agree that the conversation is quite diverse and quite different. And before I start to talk about digital identity in the Indigenous context, I want to address the previous question about stakeholders and their roles. And I think that a lot of the problems with the way technology is being implemented, particularly in the global south, is that it's based around a model of digital feudism. And this is, you know, a medieval concept of how economic order was placed back in the Dark Ages, where kings and lords would control all the power, and they would divest that power onto people down a pyramid chain, and the citizens would basically be sort of the powerless users. And we have this model in the way technology is being developed, specifically in the South and specifically in Southeast Asia, where you have a lot of investments into infrastructure developments and other projects that are being supported bilaterally between governments through aid development. They're being transitioned to national level governments who don't necessarily have the capacity or the will to implement things in an equitable manner. And so you perpetuate this model from the north down to the south, and it's even in a situation where there's absolutely no rule of law and governance structures to make anyone accountable. It perpetuates this violation of human rights fundamentally, further and further in a framework of technology. And for Indigenous peoples, how this relates and how this is actually disenfranchising them even further and further from development and basic human rights is the fact that in the identity space, as I'm going to use that as a use case example, they don't exist. So under most national frameworks in Southeast Asia, except for perhaps the Philippines, there are no frameworks to recognize Indigenous peoples as a self-sovereign governance entity, which is actually allowed under international laws and conventions. And most countries in Asia are signatory to this convention. It's called the UN DRIP, United Nations Indigenous Peoples Rights. And they get around this technically because of certain constitutional laws in country that divest Indigenous peoples to actually exercise their rights to self-determination. And this then divests their rights to citizenship, to access to public services, to all amount of things within the country. And I know Jay already raised this, and it's a real problem here. And for Indigenous peoples, it deliberately disconnects them also from rights and access to land and natural resources. So when you look at how identity is defined within this space, there are self-determination rights, there are community identification parameters, and there are external identifying agents that define identity of people. Indigenous peoples actually use all of these to define themselves. So they not only as a collective community define themselves individually as a person, but their cultural identity and connection to land and natural resources is fundamentally key in how they determine their collectivized state. And because they are allowed to exercise their own self-sovereign governance, it also means that they can actually have the right to determine their own identity as a self-governing people. That's a really difficult concept for a lot of national governments to accept, because then that would mean that within a national boundary, you would have effectively two different governing systems for a national identity. And how would that work? So I think these alternative frameworks to look at how to invest in the rights of Indigenous peoples to maintain their own identity within a national system are discussions that are only just starting to begin. And I think that that is beginning in some parts of the US and North America, and in New Zealand, where the Maori ethnic community are really proactive in their governing structures within the country to look at how the rights frameworks that protect Indigenous identity can be incorporated into national frameworks. And I think these sort of discussions and nuances are not mainstream yet, and they do need to have a presence and a platform to be able to then to shift the way technology is being implemented across the board, and how identities, digital identity in particular, is being thought of.
Okay, there was one question I will quickly ask you before going to the next panelist. So is this concept of digital federalism related to data colonialism?
Yes, exactly. So in the same way that Indigenous peoples were colonialized and their lands and natural territories were taken over, it's the same concept also with their data. And so in Myanmar, is a classic example, where I live at the moment, the national constitution only accounts for 130, I think it's 136, please don't quote me on that, ethnic groups. So if you don't identify as one of those ethnic groups, you fundamentally don't exist. And so if you don't exist, when they go around and collect the national census, you actually are not represented within the data. And so that data set then becomes a model of data colonialism, where they've defined what constitutes a person to have a right within the national data set and census. And it's perpetuated in every sense, not only in the national census, but when you look at development data, when you look at other data that's being collected by researchers, the definitions on who is able to be represented in those data sets are defined externally from the actual people whose data is being gathered. And so I think this is definitely a huge problem, and there are movements that are trying to counter this approach of how extractive data models are being exercised across the region.
Okay, thanks. Well, I must say that my mind is stretching and bending and hopefully not breaking here again. This is really something that all the when looking even just on the tiny part of technology on identity, the discussions are very wide and complex, and people are speaking past each others, and there are lots of wars on the technology side on different standards, etc., and the concepts. And now kind of widening it all open to the next level of not even having the same base understanding of what identity consists of. I think this is something that we really need to educate ourselves to understand better. I will welcome to this virtual panel seat next person who has lots of experience on this field. So Kristina, I know that you have been working, okay, we heard about Indigenous people, but then there is also other question altogether with refugees. So how would you describe the relationship between refugee identity and government issued identities?
Thank you, Yogi. I think there are two approaches that we have seen, and it's really balancing the utility of that identification versus sort of easiness of issuance. And what I mean is, identity is about assurance. Assurance is very important, right? So if you want those people to start acting as, get access to a bank account or even healthcare services, the backup from the government is very important, right? The government-backed identification is what gives that legitimacy. But what if, again, the government is refusing / not interested in providing that identity in the first place? And that's where more sort of bottom-up approach emerges, where essentially it's balance between how, as a core of identity, I think, is how do we portray, how do we want others to see us, and how others do see us, right? It's this interface is what identity really is at a core. So, and which means it's really, really tight relationships, right? So what if we could reconstruct from bottom up that relationships and allow people to use those identification to get at least first level of initial sources, and then slowly build up trust that would lead to the government level identification. I think that is one of the learnings that we have seen. And also, when we talk about the digital identity, right, it means it involves technology, but how many people, not just limited to marginalized populations, actually knows the nitty-gritties, and especially the new types of technology we are discussing, some usually user-centered, user having more options, does sometimes imply more need for education on the user side. So the tech savviness is sometimes, not, I don't want to use the word barrier, but it is a challenge sometimes. And I think that's important to point out. And finally, it's also sort of tied to the new economic sort of models in the space. So, some say that by providing that identification to marginalized populations, they not only, will be able to get access to different services, but also can utilize their data in, ideally profitable ways. So, giving more digital sovereignty or autonomy, data security. But how do we balance that with sort of, aren't we providing means of maintaining and maybe even extending the bureaucratic and commercial power, but actually bringing people who maybe were comfortable being, invisible into the visibility, right? So as I feel like as people work, as someone who's worked with, trying to raise that invisibility cloak, it's also a lot of responsibility. How do we raise the invisibility cloak, and how to strike a balance between empowerment and not contributing to more control over those populations by those bureaucratic powers. So I think there's a lot of open questions in this space as well. But as there are more and more initiatives in the space, we're increasingly learning more and more.
Thank you. So last to this panel, I will invite Charlie on stage. And my initial question for you is that what do you think should be the best model to build digital ID infrastructure in African countries?
Thank you, Yogi. And thank you for all the panelists before me, because they have taught me so many things. Thank you for that. When we talk of identity or digital identity or identity, when it comes to Africa, where I live, we might say that we are really, really in great trouble, as I might say banally. And, in the world, you have 1 billion people who are identityless, and you have 500 millions in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa. It tells you clearly the kind of very dramatic situation we are in. You have been given, our panelists have been giving us examples of, type of exclusions, service exclusions that those who don't have identity or a way to identify themselves through the system may face. And we see clearly that Africa, as we have been talking of this digital feudalism and data colonization, we are suffering not actually of digital form of feudalism, but of the consequences, historical consequences of feudalism and colonization. Because as you know, most of our countries, they have been weaponizing identification for political sake. And that's the problem we have. And demography in my country and in so many countries here, you see that census and demography has been used as political whip to make sure the ruling party is, is voted by, those who are in favor, and then to exclude from voting, those who are duped against political parties. So it brings us into a kind of situation where culturally identifying people has been always difficult. And you will see also that people have been self-censoring themselves from being identified because of political issues. If you get back to maybe 4 decades when our people was, even in most of the colonized world, when there was a fight between colonizers and their proxies in countries, you will see that identifying themselves, or maybe identifying their children, their families, to make sure they can escape, surveillance. And those are the things we see today when in this digital world, because people don't actually trust all what is being set up, for identification. That's the problem, because you always have in your mind, back in your mind, that what will be the use of this identification scheme? What will be the use of this identification technology, or maybe process program that is being set up? So when you get to this, you have to think about, Pyrou just talked about it. We need a kind of participatory approach, not in technology actually, but a kind of participatory approach that creates a kind of trust, a space of trust before we move on to digital identity. We will see it from my country today. You see clearly that there are so many people refraining from using Facebook because of fear of surveillance. Just to take an example, how will we ensure perfect identification in a context where people are not don't trust government that is actually there to lead the identification process? And in Africa now, just to solve the problem of foundational identification like birth registration or maybe ID, we have about 23 countries pushing for some sort of programs to issue those national IDs. And we see that there are still so many problems because maybe people don't actually have resources to pay the cost of those ID issues. Those are things that in the developed world is not actually a problem. You don't even think of it. That is granted, actually. That is almost granted by default. But in our context, you see clearly that we have so many issues that are linked to the type of the mindset, the political mindset that is leading identification process. And if you add to it the fact that our citizens think that government is actually coalescing with big, technologies that bring solutions, for mass surveillance. And we have seen this with big companies here in Africa leading our digital strategy. We are always thinking of the fact that government will certainly be using those technologies to implement kind of mass surveillance. And to mass surveil people, you need to identify them. And that's the kind of problem we need to solve. And for me, we must first of all make sure we set up a group of a kind of working space where human centricity is the culture and the spirit of any type of digital identity process. That's my view, because we depend actually on the kind of on the state of the mind that is ruling now this space. That's what I would say for the first for this first round.
Okay, thanks, thanks, Charlie. This comes with a lot of knowledge and also passion, and that's what is needed also to bring these things forward in the mindset of MyData. I already mentioned the slogan what we have: make it happen, make it right. That's one part of it, and then we have another kind of mental tool that we are using. It's called this BLT sandwich: business, legal, technology, and society. And we kind of understand that in order to, we want to get these, well, here we are speaking about identity systems, but MyData in more widely, we want it to be good for the society. That's the end goal. That's kind of the make it right part. And the make it happen is that it needs to have the business models or sustainable, so that it's not created with something that just will go with the wind on the next day when money runs out. So it needs to be solid in that sense. There needs to be governance. That's the legal, but not only thinking of the law, but it can have several kinds of governance levels. And we are speaking a lot here already on the governance side, how to make that solid and robust. And then the technology. And I think here in this panel, what I've been looking on the chat that's happening aside, and then I also know your backgrounds. There are many people looking very deeply in the new technological approaches on self-sovereign identity. And here, this opens my eyes in a way that when I've been looking at the self-sovereign identity from the, let's say, Finnish and European perspective, it is more like, okay, this is handy. That's how it should be, so that we are not having these bottleneck organizations, and we have more fluidity there and people can have control. But now I'm looking that self-sovereignty is actually something much more on the word sovereignty, so that there is something that you can exist in the digital world without anybody else giving you the right of existence, so that you can, there are different kinds of terrible situations in the world where governments or circumstances don't allow rights for the people in the sense what it should be, but at least those people physically exist. So that's something that nobody can take away, but digitally people don't exist, and that's quite a big jump from there. So the self-sovereign identity thing, that you could exist digitally without depending on technologically or the governments or companies, that's something that stretches my mind further. I think we are now moving to the next phase. So unfortunately, you had such a good presentations, Kristina, Pyrou, and Charlie, on this later part. So we don't really have the panel discussion, but I will be handing over for the last 15 minutes of the session to Dixon. And I would actually want to introduce also Dixon. I didn't introduce in the beginning. He's humble guy from Japan that does a lot of work to MyData, and also elected board member now. And he always says that, oh, I don't want to speak in public. I don't want to be on the lights, but he's also the mastermind behind this session. And he made it possible to connect us here together. And we have this tradition of closing rounds in MyData. So at least Charlie and Kristina already know the drill. So the thing is that each one of the panelists can say something that you got out from this session, and to close it round, we have 15 minutes for that. And meanwhile, I think the people in the audience could do the same sort of reflections and think that what was the one thing that resonated with you, what you bring to the rest of the conference. And you can start, you can type those in the chat Unfortunately, I have other duties in the conference and I must jump from this session, but I will read the memo and see the rest. I think the last 15 minutes will be actually the best outcome from this of the reflections. And I can maybe kick off the closing round by saying that this was, for me, this was really mind-blowing. I think that's kind of a typical thing to say, but I don't know, find the right word for that. But I think that each one of us who are looking deeply on the topics of MyData from very much European or Western world concepts, I think should be having this kind of experience of hearing in 1 hour a lot of other perspectives. So lots of new stuff for me. That's my outcome from this session. But now I will hand it over to Dixon.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Thank you, Yogi, for spending your time, and then I know that you have to run. So if everyone can see my screen, I would like to remind every audience, if it's like inspiring for you, so please go to the quick chat room, the session room 1 that we have, and write down whatever you have in the share highlights tab. And then if you have any extra thing to directly to the speakers, just go to the session memo, and then it would directly to the memo, so that you can actually write whatever you want as a comment. So and then maybe get into our global Slack, and then connect each other directly. So that's whatever you can do. And then yeah, it's as Yogi has said about the closing round. So since we don't have all the minutes for the whole audience, so I would like to ask for the audience, write your closing round on the chat, and then for the speakers, just go around and throw the ball. So the questions for today, it's what I did learn today in this session. So yeah, so I'll start first. So this good thing is I met Pyrou about maybe 1 year ago, and then because she did attend the meeting in MyData, so in year 2019, and then her idea of helping the indigenous people really inspired me, and then really moved me, because I'm originally born in Vietnam, in Saigon, and then we have to run away from the communists to Hong Kong, and then from Hong Kong to Canada in Montreal. So I know how it is to have the difficulties of like handling your own identity. So that's why getting all the people together to inspire more people to think about not just technically, but how to apply those technical things to help the digital global south. It's really good. And then thank you, Pyrou, for inspiring me in the beginning. And then yeah, I will throw the ball to the other mastermind that helped me a lot. It's Jay. So go ahead. Yeah, go ahead, Jay. Can you speak?
Sorry, the full screen thing kind of messed up my buttons.
No problem.
I am really sorry. I didn't catch your question because I was too focused on the chat. Can you repeat? Now you're muted.
Sorry. So the question is, what did you learn from today's sessions? And then or you can say something about the next thing that you want people to work with you. And then afterwards, you throw the ball to any other people from the speakers. Go ahead.
Okay, what I learned, to be honest, I didn't know so much about the framework that already exists with regards to indigenous populations, and that's really fascinating, which is also kind of funny because we do have that in Brazil. I just was completely ignorant on the topic, and I am so excited about continuing to debate with these people if they will have me, because I think that there's so much work to be done with that. And it's, I don't know, at least to me, this discussion is fascinating, and I think it's super necessary. So
thank you. So can you throw the ball to Anyone from the maybe from the speaker list? Let me see if I can show everyone. Or maybe I can float for you. So I'll float the ball to Kristina.
What did I learn?
What did you learn, or what you plan to do in after these sessions?
I think the first thing I would do is reread the chat more carefully. I'm fascinated by the discussions and conversations that happened there during this hour. And yeah, different links, different considerations, opinions. I think, yeah, the notion of digital feudalism, colonialism is something I have not deeply thought through. So I think that would be a good addition to the work we do. And also the relationship between the different stakeholders. Well, it's an unending question. And I think we all agree that we have to work together. So defining the next concrete steps, I mean, it's enforced, right? So framework implementation. So yeah, I think, I'm sorry. Yeah, I think in a sense it's learning more good questions and, you know, taking time of thinking about them after the session.
Okay, good. Can you float the ball to anyone within the speaker, or you want me to do for you?
Pyrou, I'm curious about her learnings.
I'm always really excited to have these conversations because I think that a lot of the work that we're doing in Southeast Asia is very nuanced and specific to Southeast Asia, but has so many adaptable contexts across the world, in Africa and Latin America and other places. And when you think about where the population lives, I can't remember who said it in the beginning, maybe it was Jogi, most of the population lives in the global South. And yet the technology that's driving most of our lives is being developed outside of our context. And I think that has been highlighted here in the first round of panel discussions, and then to this secondary panel discussions. I think we need to really reassess how to flip that balance to drive innovation that's actually fit for purpose. And I think that's something that is a gap in this work and this space, and I think that we need to invest more in that. But again, how do you drive that innovation, and how do you fill that research gap when most of the funding is held outside of these regions as well, and there's no willpower? So at what levels in terms of policy can external actors try and influence this? At what levels, at the national and regional levels with the intergovernments within the region, to actually promote this for greater civic rights, liberties, and peace? And I think that's really fundamental when you talk about Indigenous peoples, because it's not only just a conflict about who has technology and who is identified and who has access to this. It could fundamentally resolve some of the conflicts that are going on in the region in relation to ethnic identity, in relation to the civic wars that are happening at the moment here. And I think that's a real driver to actually motivate people to innovate around this space. And it needs further discussions.
Thank you, Pyrou. So do you want to throw the ball to anyone, or I can choose for you? You can choose between Charlie, Joe, and Sherry. Charlie.
Thank you. Thank you, Pyrou. And my take from this session is that we have much work to do as a movement, you know, to build a strong voice for, you know, kind of self-sovereign identity that will give more autonomy to people. Because as I was trying to say in the chat, Global South has not been named this way because of only because of a geographical position. It has been named this way because of the low level, at least for Africa, low level of freedom enjoyed by the people. In this context, it's clear that technology, and including digital ID, may, sustain or reinforce those historic inequalities and harms. That's why when we talk of this digital feudalism or maybe data colonization, we see those things being on the table now. So while we recognize the benefits of technology, and we are on this session, using technology to meet in spite of where we are now. So while we recognize this, it's clear that we need to make sure we work on the ethics side of it. And ethics has to do with the will of, the will of those who are in power now. And we see clearly that governments and big techs are actually leading the game. And we need to be there for the society part and the legal part of our BTLS, to work, and so that it can actually reduce or maybe improve the ethical side of what we are trying to achieve for our people. Thank you. I will give to Joe.
Thank you so much, Charlie. Yeah, thank you, everyone. So it's a really eye-opening experience in the sense that we got to hear some of the more specific examples on how exactly different regions of the world progress because of the different sets of barriers, the challenges, and the different framework that need to be considered prior to applying these technologically driven initiatives. And so earlier, I think we heard a little bit from Sherry on things that are happening more so in the East Asian context, such as Taiwan, and then later on Pyrou about the large millions of indigenous population, and Charlie as well. And I think the main takeaway is that a lot of the things that Charlie and Pyrou raised actually have no predecessory models to adapt from. So I think it's definitely a lot of pioneering work that needs to be done in those areas. And yeah, again, speaking for collaboration, right? We need to be able to discuss these things and to be able to find ways to appropriately adapt different strategies and different tools that have worked in a different context where we can make viable use of that in a totally different region of the world. So yeah, it's all my takeaways. And I think the last is Sherry.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Sherry.
Okay, so actually, I learned a lot from this panel discussion, and so I can heard a lot of different countries, like from Korea, from Japan, and from Africa, and from different countries, and also I keep looking at the chat because there's so much information, and I also keep Googling what is digital feudalism, and there's a different perspective that I have never think about it. And I think what I learned today is that I think the MyData improvement is it's need a lot of discussion like this. So we need to discuss what we face and what the problem, what the barrier we encounter, and we can discuss how. And we can discuss how other countries solve this problem, and we can reference to what is the new topic, new situation, and I think that this kind of panel discussion is very important. I like to, if we have time, I think we can host many panel discussion like this, and we can discuss more. Yes, thank you.
Yes, so we are on time. So thank you very much, everyone, for the speakers to spend their time during the session meeting and everything, and then contribute. So, please go ahead if you have. Our session ends already. So if you do want to stay on to speak together, then it's still okay. But I have to go to the next meeting and helping out. So I guess if we don't close this, Tamu, it will keep on recording, right? So do you want me to stop the recording? Oh, actually, yeah. So I'll stop the recording, and then people can just chat whatever they want in here until they leave to another meetings.